This video is about the ingredients that go into making a climate in a particular part of the world, and specifically about local and regional factors. In a previous video, we talked about the amount of insolation or energy from the sun that you get at different latitudes and how that's a primary factor in creating a climate. And then after that, the next most important is usually the global winds and how the wind distributes those temperatures that the sun puts on the earth from the tropics outwards toward the poles and from the poles toward the tropics. But in this video, we're going to look at other factors: proximity to the sea, elevation, topographic barriers, and major storms, and see how they play a role as well. Let's start with proximity to the sea. Your proximity, or how close you are to the ocean, or more specifically, whether air masses that affect you develop over the ocean or not, affects your climate in many ways. First, there's the maritime effect and the continental effect. Then there's ocean currents. And then there's the presence of land breezes and sea breezes. So we'll look at all three of these separately. When we talk about the maritime versus the continental effect, we have to go back and remember what maritime air masses are and continental air masses. Maritime air masses are air masses that develop over the ocean. So you see the coast of Oregon here. There's a mass of air that's coming on shore. It developed over the ocean. That gives it two main characteristics. It's going to be moist, and it's also going to be more moderate temperatures than otherwise, because the ocean has a tendency to moderate, to bring temperatures towards the middle. If it's cold, it's going to bring it up a little bit and make it warmer. If it's hot, it's going to make it cooler. Continental air masses are the opposite. They tend to make air drier and also have more extreme temperatures, higher range of highs and lows. Continental air masses develop in the middle of continents, far away from the oceans, deep inside. So to understand why that is, the difference between maritime versus continental air masses, specific heat is the amount of heat that you need to raise 1 gram of whatever substance you're talking about, 1 degree Celsius. So if it's water, how much heat do you need to raise that water 1 degree Celsius? In this diagram, you can see on the left, it gives different substances, and then the same amount of heat is being applied to all of them, 1 calorie of heat. And that calorie is generating a 1 degree difference in temperature in the water, whereas it's a 5 and 6 degree temperature difference for things like cement and asphalt. So the specific heat of water is higher than that of land, meaning it takes more heat to make water change temperature than it does land. So the land is going to heat up much faster and cool down much faster compared to water. We can see that in this diagram of air masses right here. So we have polar air masses under the pointer here, and we have maritime polar and continental polar. They're both polar, which means they both are influenced by the same amount of insolation from the sun. They get the same energy from the sun. But one forms over the continent and one forms over the ocean. And so you see the two characteristics, the moisture and the temperature. And it says cool and moist for maritime polar over the ocean, but cold and dry for the continental. So they're both polar, but one is cool and one is cold. And the one over the ocean is cool, meaning it's warmer than the continental because the ocean is warming it up. So you could think of it a little bit like the ocean is stubborn. Water is stubborn in that it doesn't want to change temperature very easily. It requires more heat to do it. We can see the maritime and continental effects on this climate graph. This shows Dallas and San Diego, two cities. And on the map on the bottom, you can see that they're both roughly the same latitude. It tells you up at the top here, the latitudes are both 32 degrees. One is a little bit higher than the other, but it's negligible. So insolation from the sun is going to be the same at both latitudes. So that's not the reason for the difference in climate. What it's showing you is that Dallas has a very high temperature range. Right? You can see it goes further down than San Diego and also farther up than San Diego. So it's high and low is both more extreme than San Diego. And that's because Dallas is a continental location deep inside the continent, far from the ocean. Whereas San Diego is maritime. It's a maritime effect. It's creating a moderated temperature. And you can see San Diego's temperature is much more flat throughout the year. It doesn't have as many highs and lows. It's much more moderated. So that's a perfect example of the maritime effect. So this chart gives you the overall breakdown of the maritime effect versus the continental effect. As we said, maritime effect gives you moister air and a narrower range of temperatures, keeps it more moderate, whereas the continental effect creates drier air and creates a wider range of temperatures, more extremes. So the world's most extreme temperatures are going to be found in continental environments. How do these affect culture, the way we live? Well, the maritime effect creates moist and mild environments. There's plenty of rain, and those are great for farming and for forests, and that makes them great for people. So humans generally like to settle in maritime environments. It makes life easy. It's not hard to find water, and it's also not hard to find farmland. So Western Europe and the coast of California, for example, are places that people like to live, and they're dominated by the maritime effect. By contrast, the continental effect can create inland deserts far from the ocean. And they can be hot or they can also be cold. And that's because that ocean air just doesn't make it that far into the middle of the continent. And you can see on the bottom left, we have the Gobi Desert. It's one of the world's largest deserts in northern China and then Mongolia. And also you can see on the right, the huge region called the Great Basin in the western United States, which includes many deserts in Utah, Nevada, and other states like Oregon and California. So both of these deserts are the result of the continental effect. Now that we looked at the maritime versus the continental effect, let's look at another result of your proximity to the sea, which is ocean currents. And an ocean current is essentially like a river of water that flows in the larger ocean, but at a different temperature than the rest of the ocean. So this Brazil current right here is a warm current, and it runs down the side of Brazil and other countries, Argentina, and it contributes to the warmth of the Amazon rainforest. Whereas the Benguela current over here runs along the side of South Africa and Namibia, countries like that, and Southern Africa, and it contributes to the cooling of air, which prevents evaporation and precipitation. That actually contributes to the Namib Desert and the Kalahari Desert, which are found right around here in the bottom of Africa. Up here you have the Gulf Stream, which is a famous current that runs away from the east coast of the United States and becomes the North Atlantic Drift. This runs into Europe, and it brings warm tropical waters to the shores of Norway, Ireland, France, and keeps those ports ice-free all year. The California current comes down the western part of the United States and cools it down and gives California much more moderate temperatures. And the Labrador current up here actually drags icebergs out from the polar regions when they break off, and then they come down along the Labrador current. And that actually brought the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. One of the most notable climate results that happens when you have a cold current is the development of fog. Whenever warmer air from out in the open ocean here, where the pointer is, crosses over a cold current, for example, this Benguela current, that warmer air is full of humidity coming off the ocean. But then when it crosses the cold current, it gets cooled from below and starts to condense down into fog. So you can see any environment like that where you have the warmer ocean air crossing a cold current, you're going to get fog. And specifically in the south of Africa there, you get fog blowing onshore, and it creates a fog desert. So the Namib Desert up here is a desert because of low precipitation, and yet it gets moisture from fog coming onshore. And that moisture actually sustains life, plants and also animals in that desert. And thirdly, the other way that your proximity to the sea can affect weather and climate is through land breezes and sea breezes. This is the daily occurrence, the difference between day and night. So every day that the sun beats down on the land, remember the land heats up faster and cools down faster than water. So that means that the air is going to expand more on the land and become low pressure. There's simply fewer air molecules above the ground pressing down. So that means that the pressure gradient from highs to lows will go from the ocean into the land, right? Winds blow from highs to lows, and the ocean will be higher than the land. So we're going to have an onshore sea breeze coming from the water onto the land. By contrast, the same thing happens in reverse at night. Land heats up, but also cools down faster than water. And when it cools down, it then becomes condensed and higher pressure than the ocean. So now offshore breezes take place at night, called land breezes, coming from the land out to the ocean. In both cases, winds blow from highs to lows. From high to low, on the sea breeze and from high to low on the land breeze. So those are some ways that proximity to the sea can affect climate. The next factor is elevation. Higher elevations create a whole climate system. And we're going to see in a future lesson that there's an entire climate classification system called the Köppen system, Koppen, which gives initials for each different type of climate in the world, A, F, B, S, H, etc. And there's a specific climate category in the Köppen system called highland climates. And the letter for that is H. So everything we're about to talk about right here, we're really describing H climates or highland climates. So when you get to higher elevation, a lot of things change. First of all, you're simply higher up, and so there's less air above you. So that means there's less air pressure. There are simply fewer molecules of air above you, weighing down. And also that air is thinner, because remember, it takes energy, heat, to get up high, and most air is not able to do that. There's more air down towards the bottom. So the air is thinner, and the air is lower pressure. And you can see on the right, this guy has an oxygen tank because it's difficult to breathe in that thin air. He's up in the Himalayas there. Another thing that happens at high elevations is that the temperature gets colder. The Earth itself absorbs a lot of the sun's energy and then bakes the atmosphere from below by re-radiating that energy out. But the air is one of the things that traps that heat and keeps it from escaping. But if there's thinner air, less of a blanket, then more of the heat will escape. So the temperatures tend to be colder at higher elevation. You can see that in the picture in the bottom left. This guy is in Africa. He's in Tanzania. And that's a tropical country not far from the equator. And he's at Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. But even though it's tropical and very sunny, you can still see snow at the top because of the colder temperatures, because there's less air insulating that area. And the third way that higher elevations affect climates is that they allow higher levels of insulation. There's fewer air molecules to scatter the rays as they come in, especially the UV rays. This plays a role when you do mountain climbing at high altitudes, in icy areas especially. So first of all, the sun is very bright up there, can really affect your eyes. But also the sun reflects off the ice and snow with a glare. And that too is a problem. So you have to watch out for intense sun at high altitudes. Here in the Andes Mountains of Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, there's what they call altitudinal zonation, meaning that they tailor the specific activities that they do for farming according to the microclimates at different altitudes. So the bottom of the Andes Mountains, they call Tierra Caliente, which means hot land, and you have your tropical crops like the bananas down there. And then if you drive up those mountains, you'll stop seeing bananas and you'll start seeing stuff like coffee. It's usually coffee is a cooler temperatures midway up the mountains. And as you keep going, the Incas learned to plant potatoes in the colder areas of the Andes. And the Incas even had a system where the government would organize each community to plant different types of potatoes at different places and different altitudes and different communities, so that they always had a rotation of a lot of different species of potatoes. If the potatoes at one altitude didn't do very well, they still had another crop at another place and another species of potatoes. So Incas were very good at organizing farming among many communities. And if you look online, you'll see the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru, which is a seed bank that stores the genetic material of over 100 different types of potatoes, as well as other root vegetables. So we have many microclimates as we go up the Andes Mountains. At the very top, it gets too cold for trees, and that's called the tree line. And eventually it just becomes snow and ice at the top. And that snow and ice brings up another way that high elevation can affect climates and people, is that in some places that are higher altitude, you get vast areas of ice. For example, in Tibet, which is the world's largest and highest plateau, it's right behind the Himalayas, technically part of China. Tibet is often called the third pole, which means it's the third largest ice storage in the world after the North and South Pole areas. So Tibet is not all ice, but across its vast landscape, you have many areas which are covered in ice. So besides proximity to the sea and elevation, you also have topographic barriers. So when you have mountains near a coastline, you get what you call the orographic effect. The word oros in Greek means mountains. So the orographic effect is really the mountain effect. And in this picture, you can see the steps. Basically, you have maritime air, ocean air full of moisture, forming offshore over the ocean. It blows onshore. The mountains simply steer it upwards. The presence of the mountains means the air has to go up. And as it goes up, it cools, it condenses. Any water vapor in there, the droplets condense, and it forms rain or snow, which drops on this side of the mountain. You call this side the windward side, the green side, where the wind first hits. So you get lots of rain or snow, fog, floods, etc. on that side of the mountain. But the air keeps going to the other side because more air is coming behind it. But that air is dried out. So the other side, which is called the leeward side, develops a desert, an arid environment with less rain. And that's called a rain shadow. So the word rain shadow sometimes can be confusing. We call it a rain shadow because just like if I have an actual shadow, if I shine a light on myself and then there's a shadow behind me on something else, that shadow is the absence of light. A rain shadow is the absence of rain. The moist air came up the mountains, it hit the mountains, rain all fell on one side, but the air kept going and there's an absence of rain on the other side. That absence of rain is called the rain shadow. You can see the rain shadow here. This picture, we have California, Oregon on the west coast of the United States. Here's the onshore winds full of moisture, and they blow all over the west coast and make it nice and green. But then once they pass over these mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevada and the Cascades and Klamath Mountains, they come further inland and you have a rain shadow, deserts, dry behind it. In fact, most of the western U.S. is in a rain shadow. If you look at the map on the left, this is an annual precipitation map. And you see the lowest levels of precipitation on the legend are red, orange, peach, etc. And most of the western United States is those colors, very low precipitation, because there's a large number of coastal mountains in the west, not to mention the Rockies after that. But those mountains block the rain. The rain falls along the coastline, so it's very green along the west coast. But then you go inland, and it gets very, very dry, all the way to the Midwest. And you can see how that affects human settlements. On the map on the right, the U.S. population density map basically follows the rain shadow to some extent, because we have the rain shadow area with very few people, almost empty tracts in many places here, whereas the places with lots of rain, like the West Coast, are heavily populated. So now we've established three causes of deserts. In a previous video, we looked at the subtropical highs and the trade winds. We know they're dry falling air, which then sprays out across the land, like the Sahara Desert, about 30 degrees north and south, and the trade winds run from there towards the equator. Then we also talked about the continental effect, which also creates deserts like the Gobi Desert and the Great Basin. And now we also add the rain shadows, which create deserts in local areas. So these things can combine. You can have one place that has a continental effect and is in a rain shadow, or has trade wind desert and also has the continental effect. Any of these can apply, one or all three. Take, for example, Morocco, here on the coast of Africa, where the pointer is. The interior of Morocco is in the Sahara Desert. That's under the trade winds. It's a trade wind desert. But at the same time, it's also in a rain shadow of the Atlas Mountains, which run all across the western part of North Africa. If you look at the Mojave Desert, the Sonora Desert, the Chihuahua Desert of the southwestern U.S. and Mexico, they're also in rain shadows behind those coastal ranges like the Sierra Madre and the Sierra Nevada. But they're also under the subtropical highs and the trade winds. And then if you look down in South America, you see the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. It's the driest place in the world. No rain has ever been recorded there. And the Atacama Desert is under the trade winds because it's inside the tropics, but at the same time, it's in the rain shadow of the tall Andes Mountains. So the trade winds come from the east, they flow over South America, losing all their moisture. And by the time they get to western South America, then they have to cross over the Andes Mountains. Any bit of moisture left over is dropped on the windward side of the Andes on the east. By the time it gets to the other side where the Atacama Desert is, There's none left. So it's extremely dry. So it's interesting to note that you can have a desert like the Atacama Desert right along the coast because the air masses that affect that area are coming from the other direction, not from the ocean, but from the continental direction. So the last major factor we'll look at that helps to create climates is the presence of major storms. By major storms, we mean cyclones. For example, tropical cyclones, which include hurricanes that we see in the United States. Those ride along the trade winds. You can see the path of the hurricanes are taking from east to west, just like the trade winds in this picture. Cyclones also include mid-latitude cyclones, the storms that form along the polar front, where the polar easterlies meet the westerlies. This is a very strong front because you have tropical westerlies meeting polar easterlies, so it's a very big difference in temperature on either side. And this is what creates the blizzards that we have in the wintertime. When that polar front comes down over most of America and it goes back and forth, bringing snowy weather and blizzards over us. What we call a hurricane goes by other names in different parts of the world. In the Pacific, they call it a typhoon. And in the Indian Ocean, they call it cyclones. The region that has the highest number of these tropical storms and cyclones is actually the Pacific. They have more typhoons than we have hurricanes. But all these tropical storms, no matter what you call them, typhoons, hurricanes, or cyclones, they all travel east to west because they're driven by the trade winds. And they all have the same basic form. On the left, you see a cyclone, whether it's a mid-latitude cyclone, also known as the extratropical cyclone, or just a tropical cyclone, like a hurricane. They all have the same form of winds blowing from highs to lows. You have a big low in the middle, like an L on the map. That's the eye of the hurricane. You can see all the winds around are running into that low. Then they converge and they go up. And they form a wall of spinning, rainy clouds around the low, spiraling wall of clouds. And the opposite of a cyclone is not a storm at all, but clear skies, which is an anticyclone. And that's what our subtropical highs are. Simply high air falling out of the sky and then spreading out, forming the trade winds and westerlies. Remember that polar front moves up and down over the course of the year. And that's because the westerlies move up and down because they're coming out of the subtropical highs, which are part of the Hadley cell, which is driven up and down by the movement of the sun's direct rays. And those blizzards and that severe snowy weather that lasts for months and months and months affects human communities over time. In the Middle Ages, people in Spain, for example, used to sleep for most of the day during the wintertime. And it changes the rhythm of farming. You farm during the warm months and you harvest and you pack things away and preserve them to last you through the winter. One of my favorite cities is Quebec City in Canada, which is the capital of Quebec province. Winter in Canada lasts a long, long time. So it becomes part of their culture and they adapt and they still have a good time, even though it's cold and snowy. So that's a look at local and regional ingredients of climate. As we go forward, we're going to put all these factors together and we're going to go on a tour of world climates and see how do these ingredients create specific climates in different parts of the world.